Hello and welcome to the final lesson on 2.5 competition, which is what is meant by monopoly and oligopoly. So by the end of this topic, you will be able to achieve the fourth and final learning outcome, which is to explain the meaning of monopoly and oligopoly and how they differ from competitive markets. So in a sense here, when we're looking at monopoly, we're not so much looking at competition, we're really looking at the opposite of competition. And if you remember in the lessons on this, we drew a spectrum from one pole to another pole. And on one extreme, we had a pure monopoly with only one business in the market. On the other extreme, we had competition where there were several firms in the market. So if we think about that spectrum, pure monopoly lies at one extreme, competition lies at the other extreme, and oligopoly is going to lie somewhere in the middle, or somewhere in between, should I say, not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere in between. Exactly where oligopoly lies in between, whether it's towards the monopoly end or the competitive end, depends on the nature of that industry. It depends on the type of oligopoly itself. So there are two definitions of monopoly that you need to know. The first one is a pure monopoly, which is a single firm in the market, one firm only in the market. So it's either a sole producer or a sole seller of a good or service. In the UK, however, and in other countries, the EU and the US and other places, a business has got a legal monopoly if it has at least 25% of the market. Now, that doesn't mean that monopolies are illegal. It just means that there are certain practices that firms with more than 25% or 25% or more of the market cannot do legally. One is to deliberately try and drive other firms out of the market by cutting prices. Sometimes firms with this much power are prevented from buying other firms, from merging with other firms. So legal monopoly doesn't mean it's illegal. It just means there are certain laws preventing firms with 25% or more of the market from doing certain things. So that's what we mean by legal monopoly. So examples of monopolies. See if you can think, pause the video and see if you can think of examples of monopolies for the UK economy. So what businesses have a monopoly in the UK economy? Pause the video and we'll see if your answers match my answers. So the water company that supplies your house will be a regional monopoly. There are, I think, 12 different water companies in the UK, and depending on where you live, they will all be supplied by the same business. So you and I will be supplied by South East Water, for example. There is no competition for water provision for South East Water. So that is an example of a pure monopoly. If you live elsewhere in the country, if you live in London, I think it's Thames. And if you live in the north of the country, it's a different water company again. But depending on where you live, it's a monopoly. Rail franchises. So if you want to go from Headcorn, where I live, into Tunbridge, then there is only one route provider. There's only one train company that can take you from one place to another, which is South East Rail. And similarly, if you want to go to Hastings, it's either South East or Southern Rail from Tunbridge Wells. I forget which one. But generally speaking, there's only one business that can take you. There is competition on some routes in the UK, but generally speaking, if you pick a rail route, there tends to be only one business that will provide that route. We can also think about other examples of local monopolies other than just the water company example. So a motorway service station on a particular road could be an example of a local monopoly. So if you are very low on fuel and the next service station is 25 miles away, it may be that you have to use that nearest service station. There's no competition. Similarly, in terms of cinemas, particularly today as independent cinemas and smaller cinemas tend to be closing, then your local multiplex might be the only cinema that you are able to go to. So it's a local pure monopoly. Now, apart from those three examples, it's quite hard to think of examples of pure monopolies. So in the exam, you will probably get credit for giving examples of monopolies that are almost pure monopolies, if not quite pure monopolies, because it's very hard, except under special circumstances, to think of businesses that have exactly 100% market share. And you might want to think about why. that would be. But Wrigley had about 95% of the UK chewing gum market in 2016. Android today have around 85% of the global smartphone software market. That might surprise you that iOS isn't higher than 15%, but this is the global market, not just the UK and the US. And Google have about 90% of market share in the search engine market. So in terms of monopoly, here's a question for you to consider. This is not what I want you to do in the back of your books. This is what I want you to consider as you are watching this lesson. So we've got a supply and demand diagram here. And this is a perfectly competitive market. So initially we have competition in the market. And if competition is in the market, then the price will be determined where demand meets supply at P1 and the equilibrium quantity will be Q1. So price P1, quantity Q1 if there is competition. Now, suppose a monopoly with price setting power takes over this market. And what will a monopolist do? Well, if it's one firm in the market and it faces no competition, it will have some price setting power. Because if it raises its price, there is no other firm that customers can go and buy from. So the monopolist tends to have price setting power. So it decides to charge a price above the competitive equilibrium and it will supply whatever is demanded, draw the impact on the market. So pause the video and in rough, see if you can draw the impact of what I'm saying of prices in a monopoly. Pause the video and we'll see if your diagram matches my diagram. So hopefully your diagram looks something like this. So the competitive price is P1, Q1, but the monopolist, because the monopolist faces no competition, it can charge a higher price. So you have to draw your higher price PM, which is the monopoly price, above the competitive price P1. Anywhere above P1 is fine. I wouldn't put it right up to the y-axis where the monopolist would sell zero products. However, you want the QM, their quantity of the monopolist, to be greater than zero. So you want that to be somewhere along the x-axis, not at the origin. So what the monopolist will then do is it will supply the amount demanded at that price. So if the monopolist decides to set a price of PM, then it will have to sell the amount demanded at that price, which is QM. Now, another thing the monopolist can do is it can do it the other way around. It can decide to sell QM, but then it will have to take the price given on the demand curve. So the monopolist can do either but not both. It can either set the price and then supply QM, or it can set the quantity and then the price is then determined for the monopolist. But either way, the monopolist has some control over the price and quantity, whereas with a perfectly competitive firm or a firm in a competitive market, it does not have that control. So the key lesson here with monopoly is that the monopolist has price setting power. It is able to charge a higher price than firms in a competitive market. PM is above P1. So a question we need to consider that I'd like you to consider now is how do monopolies become monopolies? So let's give you a reminder of the best examples of pure monopolies from earlier: regional water companies, rail franchises, and motorway service stations and cinemas. So how do monopolies become monopolies? Pause the video and see if you're right. So the reason why monopolies exist can be summed up with one phrase in economics we call is barriers to entry. Barriers to entry. So obstacles that prevent other firms, potential competitors, from entering the market. So there are 4 examples you need to know for your syllabus. One is a legal barrier. So as we said, it's illegal for water companies other than South East Water to deliver water through your taps. There's no competition faced by Royal Mail for letter delivery to your home. Delivery to businesses is different and parcel delivery is different. There's competition in those areas. But letter delivery to your home and water, then there's no competition. The government deems it so. A second example is economies of scale. So sometimes larger firms are just much, much more efficient than smaller firms who might have in economics what we call a natural monopoly. Again, a water company might be a good example here. Gas supply is a possibility. Certainly the national electricity grid or the national grid. It would make no sense to have more than one national electricity grid. It would make no sense to have more than one channel tunnel, for example. So economies of scale could be a second one. Third one is location. We've looked at local monopolies already. So the village post office might be the only place for you to buy things like stamps or cards or wrapping paper or whatever it is you buy from the post office until you can go somewhere else. You might have a local baker shop, or there may be just one corner shop in your village or town. There may only be one restaurant, there may only be one local pub. So if they've got local monopoly, then that's a barrier to entry as well. Patents or copyrights is another one. A patent gives a business a legal right over a particular type of technology or product. So Google and Apple are really good examples here. Intel in the processing market. They have patents on lots and lots of different technologies for all sorts of weird and wonderful small micro components that go into these gadgets, which means that no other business can legally copy those designs or technologies, or if they do, they've got to pay an awful lot of money in order to have the right to do so. And businesses can't afford to do this, or they legally can't do this. So this also acts as a barrier to entry, a patent. Patent is a legal right to a firm's exclusive use of a particular technology or product. So now we come to oligopoly. So what is an oligopoly? And we have done a lesson on this already, so hopefully this will be fairly quick to go through. And an oligopoly is where we have a small number of firms with a high market share. Games consoles is one example that we've seen. We've looked at supermarkets as well as an example over the course of this module. The strict definition of an oligopoly is where the 5 largest firms have 50% or more market share. And the key features of oligopoly include, and the really important one is number 1 there, which is interdependence. So the actions of one firm affect those of the other firms. What you do depends on what your rivals do. So if a new supermarket, a relatively new supermarket like Aldi or Lidl, decides to charge lower prices, then it has to consider whether or not one of the other supermarkets will respond to that. Similarly, if a firm is deciding to raise its price, let's say a petrol station wants to raise its price, it has to consider, will the other petrol stations in the area, will they also raise their prices? Sometimes firms in an oligopoly try to control the prices. They try to agree to charge the same price and not undercut each other. That is called collusion, but that is illegal in the UK and in other countries. Number 2, there's high barriers to entry. This is also a characteristic of a monopoly, as we saw earlier. The barriers may not be quite as strong as in a monopoly, but they will still be significant. We have strong branding, and really oligopoly is where you will tend to have this feature the most. Any industry where there are really strong brands, really well-known names of products, Heinz baked beans, Apple computers, Nike trainers, HSBC, Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft. This is where we tend to have the strongest branding. Possibility of collusion we have also just mentioned there. So what examples of oligopoly can you think of other than the ones that we have mentioned? Pause the video and we'll see if your examples match my examples. So there are many others, but I think these are some of my favorite examples of firms in oligopoly, but you could have many more as long as they fit the criteria that we saw earlier: interdependence, strong brands, high barriers to entry, if the 5-firm concentration ratio is 50%, so the biggest 5 firms have 50% of the market, then it is an oligopoly, or if the firms are operating in an oligopoly industry. So how do monopolies and oligopolies differ, or firms in a oligopoly, how do they differ from competitive markets? So there's 3 real reasons here. Firms in an oligopoly and monopoly are usually larger. So their position is established. They've established their position in the market, often from outcompeting other firms, perhaps having what we call a first mover advantage. And if they are selling to lots and lots of different consumers, they're going to be operating on a very large scale. So they will benefit from what we call economies of scale, which you have seen in section 2.6. So monopolies and oligopolies are more likely to benefit from economies of scale than firms that face a higher degree of competition. Firms in what we call a perfectly competitive market don't benefit at all from economies of scale. So the greater the competition, often the less likely the firm is to benefit from economies of scale. Secondly, we tend to get higher prices and lower quantities in firms that are operating in monopolies or oligopolies. The exception to that is if there is a price war in an oligopoly, which does happen quite often. If one supermarket cuts the price of milk, another supermarket then cuts the price of milk as well. You get a price war situation, and you can often get lower prices. Petrol stations may do something similar to this. And finally, there are higher barriers to entry. There are no barriers to entry in a perfectly competitive market. In oligopoly and monopoly, there are high barriers to entry. And it's those barriers to entry that create the monopoly position for those firms. So that finishes this lesson then. If you can have a look at the questions for this topic, put them in the back of your books, and then hand in all of the answers to the questions in the same document from the back of your books, please.